Here is something that should bother you more than it probably does. We have been walking around on this planet fully human, fully capable for at least 300,000 years, maybe longer, and yet everything we call civilization, the cities, the writing, the governments, the monuments, the organized trade, all of it supposedly appears in the last 5 or 6,000 years. That's it. 5 or 6,000 years out of 300,000. Which means for roughly 98% of our existence as a species, we were apparently just waiting, sitting around campfires, chipping rocks, not doing much of anything worth remembering. Does that strike you as even slightly believable? Because it doesn't sit right when you actually look at the numbers. Think about what 300,000 years means in human terms. That's somewhere around 12,000 generations of people. 12,000 generations of brains that were, from a neurological standpoint, identical to yours. 12,000 generations of people who could feel curiosity, solve problems, communicate in complex language, plan for the future, love their children, grieve their dead, wonder about the stars. 12,000 generations of fully modern human intelligence, and we're supposed to believe that virtually nothing of consequence happened until the Sumerians showed up around 3,500 BC and invented writing in southern Mesopotamia. Something about that story feels incomplete, and that feeling is exactly what this is about. Now here's the specific question that archaeologists and anthropologists have been quietly wrestling with for decades. What could 20,000 BC even mean archaeologically? When we throw that date around, we're talking about a world in the grip of the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age. Ice sheets stretched down across what is now Canada and northern Europe. Sea levels were roughly 400 feet lower than today, exposing land bridges that connected continents we now think of as permanently separated. Coastal regions that could have supported large human populations are currently sitting under hundreds of feet of ocean. Entire landscapes where people might have lived, built, traded, organized themselves into something more complex than we imagine, are gone. Not gradually eroded, drowned, inaccessible, essentially invisible to us. And here's what makes that genuinely unsettling. The archaeological record we do have from 20,000 BC already contains things that don't fit the simple story. Cave paintings of extraordinary sophistication, evidence of long-distance exchange of materials across hundreds of miles, traces of symbolic thinking, ritual behavior, and social coordination that imply organized communities with shared belief systems. We're not talking about creatures barely scraping by. We're talking about people doing things that required planning, communication, and a level of cultural complexity that the old narrative of primitive prehistory simply doesn't account for. So the real question isn't just when civilization started. The real question is what we've been missing, and why. The stakes here are bigger than they might initially seem. Because if humans were cognitively capable of building complex societies for 300,000 years, and we know they were, then the timing of civilization's apparent emergence becomes one of the most fascinating puzzles in all of human history. Were there earlier attempts that left no trace? Were there forms of social organization that don't match what we're looking for when we look for civilization? Are we using the wrong definition, looking for the wrong evidence, asking the wrong questions? Or is the conventional story actually right? And there's a perfectly good explanation for why everything we recognize as civilized behavior clusters so tightly into such a recent sliver of time. Each of those possibilities has radically different implications for how we understand human nature, for what we think people are capable of, for what a society needs before it can organize itself into something durable and complex. These aren't just academic questions, they reshape the entire picture of who we are and where we came from. Before we get into the actual archaeology, which gets genuinely wild the deeper you go, a quick note. If you're listening on Spotify, go ahead and follow the show there. You get ad-free, music-free listening, which honestly makes these long, deep dives significantly more enjoyable. The link is in the description. And speaking of listening, drop a comment right now and tell me where you are and what time it is there. I look at these every time, and it's one of my favourite things about making these. It's midnight in Melbourne and 7 a.m. in Mexico City, and someone in Norway is apparently listening while they commute in the dark. There's something almost poetic about thousands of people in different time zones, sitting with the same question about how far back our story actually goes. So tell me where you are now. Back to the mystery. The conventional timeline places the origins of civilization firmly in the ancient Near East, sometime around 3500 to 3000 BC. Sumer, the Fertile Crescent, the Nile, the Indus Valley. These are the places we point to. These are the origin stories we teach. But the more archaeologists dig, sometimes literally, the more that timeline keeps getting pushed back. Not by thousands of years, but by potentially tens of thousands. Sites are emerging that don't fit the model. Evidence is accumulating that forces the field to reconsider assumptions that seemed settled. What we're going to look at in this video is the full arc of that evidence. From what life actually looked like at 20,000 BC, to the strange and sophisticated things humans were already doing long before anyone planted the first field or built the first city. We're going to examine what civilization even means when you strip away the assumptions, and we're going to honestly confront the question of whether something important happened in deep prehistory that we simply haven't found yet, because the dates we use confidently are, in many cases, the minimum, the earliest confirmed evidence, not necessarily the beginning. And those are very different things. So before we go any further, we need to talk about the word itself, civilization, because it is doing an enormous amount of work in this conversation, and if we don't slow down and look at what it actually means, we're going to end up arguing past the most interesting questions. Ask 10 people to define civilization, and you'll get 10 different answers. But the academic version, the one that archaeologists and historians have been more or less working with since the early 20th century, tends to cluster around a set of specific criteria: cities writing, state-level government, surplus food production, economic specialization, monumental architecture. The idea is that when you see most of those things appearing together, you're looking at a civilization. When you don't see them, you're looking at something earlier, something simpler, something less. The problem is that this definition was essentially reverse-engineered from Mesopotamia. Scholars looked at Sumer, identified what made it distinctive, and then used those features as the checklist. Which means we built the definition around the example, and then went looking through all of human history to find other places that matched that same example. That's a little like defining music as whatever sounds like a Beethoven symphony, and then concluding that most of human history had no music. Here is what the checklist misses. Complexity doesn't require a king and a scribe. A society can be extraordinarily sophisticated in its organization, its knowledge systems, its long-distance relationships, its cosmology, its engineering, without ever developing writing as we recognize it or producing the kind of centralized state that leaves administrative records. These things are not the same as civilization. They are one version of it. Probably not even the first version. Archaeologists have increasingly moved toward thinking about this as a spectrum rather than a threshold. Instead of asking, did these people have civilization? The more useful question is, what kind of complexity are we seeing? And what does it tell us about how these people organized themselves and understood their world? That shift sounds subtle, but it changes everything about how you interpret the evidence. Think about what archaeologists can actually infer from what survives. Stone tools tell you something about cognitive sophistication, about planning and abstraction. The fact that someone hafted a blade to a handle means they understood leverage and thought through a multi-step manufacturing process. Burial goods tell you something about belief systems and social hierarchy. If some people get buried with more than others, That tells you status existed, that it was meaningful enough to mark in death. Trade materials that appear hundreds or thousands of miles from their geological source tell you that people were maintaining relationships across vast distances, which requires communication, trust, probably some form of obligation and reciprocity. That's social infrastructure, even if no one wrote it down. What archaeology cannot easily tell you is things like governance structure, language complexity, oral traditions, kinship rules, cosmological systems, seasonal ceremonies, the names people gave to stars. All of that is invisible in the dirt, which means the gap between what actually existed and what we can reconstruct is immense. When we say the evidence shows no civilization before a certain date, what we really mean is that the evidence that survives and that we've excavated so far doesn't show the particular markers we associate with one specific type of civilization. That's a very different claim. This is where the distinction between three related but different terms becomes genuinely useful. Culture, in the anthropological sense, is essentially universal. Every human group has culture. Every group has language, symbolic behavior, shared practices, transmitted knowledge that goes back at least 300,000 years and probably much further. Complex society is something more specific. It implies differentiation, people playing different roles, some degree of hierarchy or at least coordination at a scale beyond a single family group. It implies institutions, even informal ones, that persist beyond individual lifetimes. Civilization in the strictest sense layers on top of that. Writing, urbanism, bureaucratic states, the whole apparatus. The mistake is treating these as a strict ladder where you can't have the second without the first, or the third without the second. Reality is messier and more interesting than that. You get societies with enormous monumental architecture and no writing. You get long-distance trade networks with no cities. You get sophisticated astronomical knowledge embedded in oral tradition rather than inscribed on clay tablets. Are those civilizations? By the Mesopotamian checklist, no. By any reasonable measure of human achievement and social complexity, the question becomes genuinely interesting. What we're going to find as we go further back through the record in this video is that the traits we associate with civilization don't appear suddenly in Sumer as a package deal. They appear earlier in fragments, in different combinations, in places that don't fit the textbook map. Long-distance trade appears tens of thousands of years before cities. Monumental construction appears before agriculture. Symbolic systems that imply shared cosmology appear before any of the usual civilization markers. These fragments don't necessarily mean there was a lost civilization waiting to be discovered somewhere, but they do mean the story of how humans got to Sumer is far longer and stranger than the standard timeline implies. Here's a useful way to hold all of this. Think of civilization not as a destination that societies arrive at after enough time passes, but as a set of solutions to particular problems. How do you coordinate large numbers of people who don't all know each other? How do you store and transmit knowledge across generations? How do you manage resources that no single family group can fully control? How do you maintain trust and cooperation with people who are not your relatives? Different societies develop different answers to those questions at different times and in different places. Writing is one answer to knowledge transmission. Cities are one answer to coordination. But they are not the only answers, and they were not the first attempts. When we ask how old human civilization really is, we're essentially asking how far back we can trace serious, organized human attempts to solve those problems at scale. And when you frame it that way, the answer starts looking a lot older than 3500 BC. Not because there are ancient cities buried under the ocean, though that possibility isn't off the table either, but because the cognitive and social foundations of civilization were being laid in deep prehistory by people who were every bit as intelligent as the Sumerians, and who had vastly more time to work with, How much of that work they actually got done is the question we're here to explore. If the real question is how far back do these solutions go, the next uncomfortable step is admitting how blind we are the further back we look. Deep prehistory isn't just far away in time. It's behind layers of selective destruction. We're trying to reconstruct a library from the few books that happen to be printed on stone. Start with the most basic filter. What actually survives long enough to be found? Human life runs on things that rot. Wood, fibre, rope, leather, baskets, woven mats, clothing, food, thatch, bone tools sharpened just enough to be useful but not enough to impress a museum curator. All of that is what people touch, make, break, repair every single day. In most environments, it disappears. A wooden house in a temperate climate doesn't persist for 20,000 years. It collapses, gets eaten by insects and fungi, is trampled, burned, washed away. Textiles fall apart even faster. The most complex object in a community might be a canoe that took months to shape, a latticework granary, a giant wooden pole carved with symbols, a ceremonial costume woven from plant fibres. Archaeologically, that registers as a couple of post holes and a stain in the soil if you're lucky. Stone is the exception. It's why entire eras get named after it. Stone tools survive not because they were always the most important technologies, but because geology is kinder to flint than to flax. If you judged our own society purely by what would survive 100,000 years of weathering, you would think we were obsessed with ceramics, glass, stainless steel, and the occasional granite countertop. This preservation bias matters enormously when people start asking, where is the evidence for older complexity? If a hunter-gatherer group 30,000 years ago builds a wooden causeway across a swamp, strands a whole coastline with fish traps and weirs, weaves giant nets, carves boats, makes elaborate clothing and symbolic regalia out of feathers and plant fibers, the default outcome is that almost none of that makes it into the deep time record. What we get instead is a scatter of stone points, and maybe, if the preservation gods are feeling generous, a shell bead or two. Now add a second filter, the places we're actually looking. For most of human history, the best real estate was near water. Rivers, deltas, lagoons, estuaries, shallow bays, those are the places with abundant food, easy transport, rich ecological edges. If you were going to get repeated seasonal aggregation of people, large ritual gatherings, big communal projects, that's where you'd expect to find them. There's just one problem. The coastline your Ice Age ancestors knew is not the coastline we see today. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, global sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are now. Whole continental shelves were dry land. The Persian Gulf was a broad river valley. Southeast Asia was stitched together into a super-peninsula we call Sunderland. Britain was connected to Europe by a low, habitable plain that later drowned and became the North Sea. Every metre of sea level rise is a moving eraser, chewing its way inland. Whatever people built along those Ice Age shorelines, campsites, fish processing areas, boat landings, modest wooden villages, seasonal gathering grounds, spent a few thousand years on the surface and then went under the waves. Some of that is gently buried and potentially recoverable. A lot of it is gone, shredded by currents, buried under meters of shifting sediment. So when someone points at the present coastline and says, "Look, we see nothing older than X," they're really saying, we see nothing older than X on the thin ribbon of land that happened not to drown when the ice sheets melted. That is not the same thing. And the land that did remain above water hasn't exactly been sitting still either. Over tens of thousands of years, landscapes move. Rivers change course, sometimes gradually, sometimes catastrophically. They meander, cut new channels, abandon old ones, floodplains build up sediments, then get sliced through again. A settlement that once sat safely on a riverbank can end up buried under meters of silt or perched on a dry terrace far from the modern watercourse. Erosion is ruthless. Hills slump, valleys widen, cliffs retreat. Wind strips away soil. Landslides bury whole slopes. Volcanic eruptions lay down thick blankets of ash, obliterating surface traces, while sometimes preserving what lies beneath in exquisite detail. Glaciers grind everything under them into paste, bulldozing landscapes and any archaeology in the way. When we dig at a site that happens to have survived that whole geological gauntlet, it's tempting to treat it as representative. But it's not. It's a survivor. For every well-preserved cave or lakeshore camp we excavate, there were countless others destroyed, submerged, or rendered unrecognizable. On top of that, we're not evenly sampling the survivors we do have. Modern development concentrates excavation in particular regions. Political boundaries, funding priorities, and simple accessibility all bias where archaeologists spend their time. The map of known sites is as much a map of where modern humans have looked as it is a map of where ancient humans lived. Even when we do find something, and it survives, and we excavate it, we still face another problem: telling when it actually happened. Dating deep prehistory is a puzzle built out of half a dozen imperfect tools. Radiocarbon, the one most people have heard of, is incredibly powerful, but not magic. It works because living things constantly take in a radioactive form of carbon from the atmosphere. When they die, that intake stops, the carbon-14 starts to decay, and we can measure how much is left. The catch is that this only works for organic material, bone, charcoal, seeds, wood, and only reliably back to about 50,000 years or so. Beyond that, there just isn't enough radioactive carbon left to measure cleanly. Even within its range, radiocarbon dating needs careful calibration, because the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere has fluctuated over time. If you don't have datable organic remains, or you're going older than radiocarbon's comfort zone, you start relying more on methods like optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL. That's a mouthful, but the basic idea is simple. Grains of sand or silt accumulate trapped electrons from background radiation while they're buried and shielded from light. When they're exposed to sunlight or intense heat, those traps get emptied. OSL measures how long it's been since that last reset. It's a way of dating when a sediment layer was last exposed, not when humans were necessarily doing something with it. Layering itself, stratigraphy, is another crucial line of evidence. The principle that lower layers tend to be older than higher ones sounds obvious, but in the real world, sediments can be mixed by burrowing animals, tree roots, later human activity. Erosion can strip away whole sections. Floods can redeposit older material on top of younger layers, reading that history is an art as much as a science. All of these methods come with error bars. A radiocarbon date gives you a range of probable years, not a single precise day. OSL can be off by centuries or millennia if the sand wasn't fully reset. Stratigraphy tells you relative order, not absolute age. To build a timeline, archaeologists stack multiple lines of evidence and look for convergence. This is where sensational claims often squeeze in. You'll see headlines: 200,000-year-old city discovered, advanced civilization before the Ice Age proven. When you dig into the details, they almost always depend on stretching those uncertainties to the breaking point. Maybe a stone structure sitting in a young layer is being assigned the age of much older rock beneath it. Maybe the only date available is from a bit of shell that's been reworked from an older deposit. Maybe the error range of an OSL sample is treated as a hard minimum instead of a probability cloud. None of this means we should dismiss every surprising date. Archaeology is full of genuine shocks that force people to rewrite timelines. It does mean that in deep time, how old is this is often the hardest question to answer with confidence, and the more acclaim depends on pushing a site far beyond where most of the evidence points, the more carefully we have to look at the dating logic. So we have a record skewed towards stone, biased away from drowned coastlines, shredded by geology, and stitched back together with dating methods that get fuzzier the further back we go. That doesn't make the search hopeless. It just means that when we peer into 20,000 BC and beyond, we have to remember we're looking through a keyhole, not a window. Within that keyhole, though, there are some remarkably bright points of light. To see what life at 20,000 BC actually looked like, we need to zoom in on the world at the height of the last ice age and ask what ordinary days and extraordinary projects might have looked like for the people living there. At 20,000 BC, you're standing in the coldest chapter of the last ice age, what climatologists call the last glacial maximum. 2-mile thick ice sheets sit on top of North America and Northern Europe. Glaciers spill down mountain chains on almost every continent. Global temperatures are several degrees colder on average than today. But the important thing isn't just cold, it's contrast. Think in terms of zones. Far north, everything is locked under ice or scoured by it. Nobody lives on top of the ice sheets. They're death zones. South of that, there's a wide belt of tundra and steppe, short grasses, shrubs, hardy herbs, with herds of mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, bison, reindeer, horses. In some regions, this mammoth steppe is actually incredibly productive, like a cold grassland Serengeti. Elsewhere, deserts have expanded, especially in Central Asia and parts of Africa and Australia. Forests are pushed back into sheltered pockets, river valleys and coasts. Sea level is still more than 100 meters lower than today. Continental shelves are dry land. Wide plains connect what we think of as separate land masses. The world map you learned in school doesn't exist yet. But for your Ice Age ancestors, none of this is a satellite view. It's where can we find water this month? Where do the herds go when the snow gets too deep? Which valley will flood when the spring melt hits? Humans have already adapted to this patchwork world in 100 different ways. In glacial Europe, for example, you'll find small, highly mobile groups working what archaeologists call seasonal rounds. They don't wander randomly. They move through a known circuit of places that offer different resources at different times. A sheltered south-facing slope for winter, where the wind is blocked and the low sun still has some warmth. A river crossing in spring when reindeer migrate. A lakeshore in summer for fishing, plant gathering, maybe meeting up with other bands. These aren't aimless campsites. They're nodes in a logistical network your group has learned over generations. Shelter fits that logic too. In some regions you have caves and rock shelters, reused over and over, layers of ash and bone building up like a time-lapse of recurring visits. In the open country, people build with what they have. Mammoth bone frameworks covered with hides in Eastern Europe, semi-subterranean pit houses lined with stone or turf in colder zones, light brush shelters where winters are less severe or visits are brief. None of these are skyscrapers, but they're not crude leaf piles either. Hearths are carefully placed. Refuse is dumped in specific spots. Some sites show distinct activity zones, one area for toolmaking, another for butchering, another where people sat close together, maybe talking, repairing clothes, working bone. Because in this world clothing is not optional, it's life support. We almost never get the clothes themselves. They rot. What we do get are the tools that make clothing possible. Tiny standardized stone blades that snap into wooden or bone handles. Fine bone awls and needles with drilled eyes, showing that people are sewing fitted garments, not just wrapping themselves in skins. Cut marks on animal bones clustered around joints where tendons are stripped for sinew. Ornamented belts, pendants, and carefully worked buttons from antler and ivory. Tailored parkas, layered leggings, fur-lined boots. Those are invisible to archaeology. Bone needles and wear patterns on human finger bones are how we know they were there. Technologically, this world is not simple Stone Age. Around 20,000 BC, in many regions, stone tool industries are heavily blade-based, long, thin flakes struck from carefully prepared cores to maximize cutting edge. Some traditions use microblades, tiny slivers set into grooves in bone or antler, to create composite knives, spear tips, even harpoons. That's serial production and modular design. Bone, antler, and ivory are turned into barbed points for fishing and seal hunting, smooth spear throwers that extend the human arm and increase projectile power, possibly early snares and traps. Grinding stones appear where people are processing tough plant foods or pigments. You're looking at toolkits designed for very specific jobs, not just generic chopping. All of that is wrapped in social systems that have to solve an uncomfortable problem. Groups are small, but distances are big. Most people in this world probably live in bands of a few dozen individuals, extended families in effect. Too big and you overhunt local game, strain water sources and intensify conflict. Too small and you get inbreeding, lack of specialists, social boredom that can turn lethal. So humans do what humans are very good at. They scale horizontally. Bands are tied into wider networks through marriage, ritual gatherings and exchange. Archaeologists can see this in the way materials move. Seashells show up hundreds of kilometers inland. Exotic flints from one quarry appear across a whole region. Amber, ochre, even the teeth of animals from faraway zones become beads and pendants. Nobody is mailing packages. These things move hand to hand, as gifts, as signs of alliance, as personal keepsakes carried by people whose life histories trace long, looping paths. At certain times of year, especially when resources briefly surge, salmon runs, mass migrations, seasonal plant flushes, multiple bands may come together. Those temporary aggregations are when distant cousins meet, stories are traded, disputes are settled, marriages arranged, songs and styles, and tool tricks spread. Then people break apart again into smaller units, each carrying a slightly updated version of the shared culture. This is how you get long-distance social continuity in a landscape where no one is building permanent towns yet. Ideas, genes, and goods travel further than any one person ever will. It's here that the label hunter-gatherer starts to mislead. Yes, people hunt and gather, but that phrase often smuggles in two assumptions: that their lives are simple and that their groups are isolated. Neither is true at 20,000 BC. To live this way, you need deep ecological knowledge. You have to predict animal movement months ahead, read snow and ice conditions, understand which plants are edible now and which will kill you unless processed just right. You need logistics, where to cache food, how to carry tools, when to abandon a site before it becomes a trap. You also need politics, deciding who joins which seasonal trip, how to share a large kill, when to give or refuse a marriage partner, how to handle someone breaking group norms. Those are not trivial problems. They require negotiation, memory, threat management, probably formalized customs that don't fossilize. What you do see is the symptom of that complexity: standardized tools across huge regions, long-distance material flows, subtle regional styles in ornaments and art. These are signs of people who think in terms of us and them, of territories and traditions, of shared myths anchoring their movements through a dangerous world. So when we stand at 20,000 BC and say it's just hunter-gatherers, we're describing their economy, not their intelligence. These are the descendants of bottleneck-forged humans, running highly tuned survival systems inside a frozen, rearranged world. And some of the things they're doing at this moment, especially in caves and rock shelters, hint that the mental world they inhabit is about to become astonishingly visible. Go back to that south-facing cave your group uses every winter. From the outside, it's just another dark hole in the cliff. Inside, under layers of soot and ash, something else is happening. Around 20,000 BC, across huge stretches of Europe and beyond, caves become more than shelters. They become message boards, theatres, memory palaces, and maybe even portals. The walls start to fill up, horses with arched necks and flared nostrils, bison with massive shoulders, mammoths, aurochs, ibex, lions, rhinos, not stick figures. Some of these paintings show shading, deliberate use of the rock's curves to give a sense of volume and motion. Lines over lines, sometimes superimposed across generations. In spots like Lascaux or Chauvet, it's not a doodle here and there. It's a full visual tradition with recurring motifs, preferred animals, even what look like stylistic schools. That alone tells you something huge. People share ideas about what is worth painting and how to paint it. Nobody hauls torches deep into a cave, mixes pigments, scaffolds themselves up to paint on high ceilings, if the result is meaningless. These are costly activities, time, calories, risk. When lots of groups do the same costly thing for thousands of years, you're staring at shared meaning. What that meaning was is harder to pin down. Maybe the herd animals on the walls are part of hunting magic, attempts to influence the outcome of the next reindeer migration or bison drive. Maybe they're stories about origin beings, mythic prototypes of the animals people depend on. Maybe the dense clusters of lines, dots, hand stencils and abstract signs are memory devices, cues for storytelling or ritual sequences. Different researchers have tried to crack the code. Some see lunar calendars, others see clan signs, others see shamans' visions. The honest answer is, we don't know yet, but we can say this much with confidence. These images aren't random decoration. They are symbols loaded with shared significance, understood well enough that the tradition persists for centuries in the same cave systems. And it's not just caves across the same Ice Age world. People start carrying symbols with them. Carved figurines show up in campsites, not just in deep grottos. The famous Venus figures, small female forms with exaggerated breasts, hips and bellies, are found from Western Europe into Russia over spans of thousands of years. Some are detailed, others are highly stylized. A few are tiny, polished from handling, as if they lived in pouches or hung from belts. Are they fertility charms? Clan mothers, goddesses, pornography, teaching tools about pregnancy and birth? Again, we can't be certain. But when a specific body style appears across thousands of kilometers, that suggests more than individual taste. It hints at shared ideas about womanhood, reproduction, maybe status and beauty. A portable iconography. There are animal figurines too, from carefully carved mammoths and lions to abstract objects whose meaning has vanished with their makers. Small engraved plaques, bone rods etched with lines and curves, pendants scratched with patterns. Some may be tallies, counting systems or markers of time. Some may be purely aesthetic. Others might encode stories only the initiated could read. Then there's the jewellery. Beads made from shells, teeth, ivory, bone, pierced fox canines, arranged in regular patterns in burials, sewn onto clothes and headdresses. Thousands of tiny perforated shells painstakingly strung into belts, caps, necklaces. In some graves, you can reconstruct entire outfits from the concentration and orientation of beads. All of this screams identity. You don't wear a specific pattern of teeth and shells to keep predators away. You wear it to say, I belong to this group, or I've earned this role, or I participated in that ritual. Think of them as Ice Age uniforms, medals, fashion statements, and passports all at once. Because remember those long-distance exchange networks from the previous section. When shells from a distant coast show up in an inland grave, carried and traded across multiple bands, the person who wears them is also wearing a story. My mother's sister came from the sea. Our people are connected to faraway waters. The ornament is a compressed narrative. The symbolic explosion isn't just visual either. It's audible. In a few remarkable sites, archaeologists have found musical instruments, flutes carved from vulture wing bones, mammoth ivory tubes with carefully spaced finger holes. These aren't random drilled sticks. The holes are placed so that modern musicians can play scales on them. The makers understood pitch intervals well enough to tune an instrument. It's one thing to hum around the fire. It's another to design a tool whose whole purpose is to produce specific tones. Music doesn't fossilize, but instruments do, and they point to something powerful, coordinated sound, probably tied to ritual, songs that everyone knows, rhythms used in group dances, maybe lullabies, war songs, hunting chants, stories sung so they're easier to remember. If you've ever tried to memorize a list of disconnected facts versus a catchy song, you know why this matters. In a world with no writing, melody and rhythm are memory technology. That brings us to myth and teaching. Forget the stereotype of primitive people living in an eternal present. An Ice Age band lives inside a dense web of remembered places, ancestors, disasters, and lucky breaks. The year the river froze early, the time the mammoths stampeded the wrong way, the cave where our mother's mother saw the lion spirit. Cave paintings, figurines, ornaments, and music turn those memories into shared narratives. The image on the wall is where the story starts. This is the great bison our people followed when the ice came. The beads on a child's clothing might mark them as belonging to a lineage with a particular animal protector. A song sung during a midwinter gathering might encode practical knowledge, migration routes, plant cycles, wrapped in a tale about supernatural beings. You can think of Ice Age art as the user interface for a much larger operating system, myth. Myths aren't just made-up stories, they're systems of explanation, moral codes, instructions on how to behave, warnings, maps of social obligations. Once a group has rich symbolic tools, images, objects, music, ritual gestures, they can build myths that tie generations together. That's civilization's mental scaffolding. Notice what's missing from this picture. There are no wheat fields yet, no barley terraces, no cities. Herds are still wild. People are still mobile, but the things we usually associate with high culture art, ritual, complex identity markers, long-distance styles, shared myths, are already flourishing. Symbolism is not an afterthought of farming, it comes first. In fact, you could argue that the capacity to maintain large, shared symbolic systems is what makes later agriculture and cities possible. Being able to agree that certain marks, objects, or performances mean something even when the original makers are gone is exactly what you need for land boundaries, property claims, gods of the harvest, and eventually tax receipts. At 20,000 BC, nobody is writing ledgers, but people are already rehearsing the skills that ledgers depend on: collective belief in unseen connections, trust in shared symbols, the ability to teach a child that this mark, this tune, this figure stands for something bigger than itself. And those symbolic systems don't just float in the air. They ride on objects that move, shells, beads, carved pieces of bone, along the same routes as flint and obsidian. Which raises an obvious question. If meanings and stories can travel as far as the materials that carry them, how far were these Ice Age networks really reaching? How big was the known world for people who had never farmed a single field? To answer that, we have to follow the artifacts as they cross mountains, rivers and coastlines, into the realm of long-distance trade, before anyone has domesticated a grain. Follow one of those beads, not in your hand, but backwards along its journey. The fox tooth on your necklace might have come from the valley over the ridge. But the little seashell on the same string? That's a problem. You live 1,000 kilometers from the coast. Your grandparents lived and died inland. Their parents did too. Yet shells keep showing up. Archaeologists see this over and over in late Ice Age and early post-Ice Age sites. Marine shells buried with people who clearly didn't live by the sea. Obsidian blades in camps that sit hundreds of kilometers from the nearest volcano. Blocks of beautiful greenstone jet or red ochre pigment, hauled far beyond where they naturally occur. Some of these materials are so distinctive that you can trace them like a signature. Specific chemical fingerprints in obsidian tell you which volcanic outcrop it came from. Microscopic fossils inside shell beads can point to a particular stretch of coastline. Even the crystalline structure of certain stones can narrow down their source. Again and again, the pattern is the same. Raw materials or finished ornaments show up far from home. So what's happening? Did one heroic traveller march 800 kilometres inland with a sack full of shells, trading them for furs and stories at every camp? Sometimes, maybe, but archaeologists usually see something subtler, something called down-the-line exchange. Picture it. People on the coast collect shells as food and trash. A few get polished into pendants. Coastal groups already have more than they need, so shells are cheap there. When inland visitors arrive for a seasonal meeting, maybe for a joint hunt, a ritual, or to find marriage partners, those visitors notice the shells. They're exotic, pretty, unusual, so they ask for some. The coastal group trades a handful of shells for something they don't have: good flint, animal hides, dried meat, information about conditions inland. The visitors walk away wearing a few beads and carrying a small stash. Back home, those shells are rare. Their value goes up. When a third group arrives from even farther inland, they see these strange sea things and want them. Your group can now afford to be choosy. They trade just a few shells, but they expect more in return: better tools, more meat, maybe access to a good winter campsite next year. Each step away from the coast, the quantity of shells shrinks and the cost in other goods rises. After 5 or 10 hops, you might have only 1 shell left per person. But that 1 shell is loaded with value and story. That's down-the-line exchange. Lots of short, local trades that, over generations, move objects across enormous distances. Archaeologists infer this when they see a gradual thinning out of materials with distance from the source, and no single site acting as a giant warehouse. Obsidian, for example, tends to appear in small amounts spread across many sites, decreasing as you move away from the volcano it came from. That pattern screams lots of small trades, not one big merchant caravan. But sometimes the pattern looks different. Every now and then you find a site far from the source with a surprisingly big concentration of exotic material, or crafted items whose style closely matches a distant region instead of the local one. The quantities are too high for simple trickle-down. This is where archaeologists start whispering about true long-distance trade. Not just I traded with my neighbours, but repeated, structured movement of goods along recognisable routes. Maybe certain groups become known specialists. Those people by the mountain springs always bring the black glass. Those people from the south always have the bright red ochre. And with repeated movement comes something else: relationships. You don't show up year after year at a stranger's camp with blades of volcanic glass without some kind of agreement. There have to be rules about who gets what, in what order, and on what terms. Maybe specific families own rights to certain sources or paths. Maybe certain elders handle negotiations and give speeches about ancient promises. Maybe there are ritualized gift exchanges before anyone even talks about tools. Trade networks start to look like political networks. Those shells and stones become more than just pretty things. They are proof that you belong to a web of obligations reaching beyond your own band. I wear this necklace, therefore my people are tied to the coast. We hosted their sons last winter. We owe them hospitality next year. Marriage fits into this too. One of the safest ways to stabilize relationships between distant groups is for people to marry across them. A shell necklace might literally be bride wealth, gifts moved through multiple hands to formalize a marriage between two bands who live weeks apart. A rare obsidian dagger might be a bride's brother's return gift, a way of saying, "We accept the alliance, we recognize your status." In small, mobile societies where population density is low and inbreeding is a real danger, having far-flung in-laws is not just politically useful, it's genetically useful. Trade routes and marriage routes tend to overlap. Now layer in craftsmanship. If shells are valuable inland, someone will get very good at turning shells into beads. If obsidian blades are prized, someone will specialize in making the thinnest, sharpest edges. If red ochre is important for burial paint or body decoration, someone will learn how to grind it to exactly the right texture and mix it with binders so it stays on skin. We usually imagine hunter-gatherers as all doing roughly the same tasks. But even in tiny groups, people diverge in skill and preference. One person is better at flint knapping, another at sewing, another at singing ritual songs. Over time, those differences can harden into roles. You can see hints of this in the archaeological record when particular artifact types are produced with consistent, high-end skill in one region and then travel widely. A certain kind of beautifully pressure-flaked blade or a distinctive style of bead drilling appears over and over, even when the finished object is found hundreds of kilometers away. That suggests specialists, not full-time craftspeople locked in workshops, but individuals or families known for their particular products, whose work moves farther than they do. You might not know the name of the person who bored the hole in your shell bead, but you know this is the good kind from the people near the Great River, and you treat it accordingly. This is where networks start looking suspiciously like the nervous system of later civilization. Think about what cities and states eventually need: predictable flows of materials, rules about exchange, people who spend more time making things than finding food, long-distance alliances, and shared symbols that mark who belongs to what group. All of that is already emerging in these forager networks. The routes that shells and obsidian follow are also carrying songs, stories, gossip, and ritual styles. An alliance sealed with a necklace and a feast has to be remembered. That memory becomes part of myth. Our ancestors came from the Sea People. We have the right to hunt in that valley because of the red stone our grandmother received. Over generations, routes become traditions. Certain valleys are always used as meeting places. Certain rivers are always followed when people migrate. Certain exchange partners become the ones we've traded with since the time of the Great Ice. Those traditions have inertia. They stick even as climate changes and subsistence patterns shift. When farming finally appears on the scene, it doesn't emerge into a vacuum. It plugs into a world where obsidian and shells have already been moving along established paths for thousands of years, where some groups already have prestige because of their strategic locations or their access to coveted materials. The first villages that will matter most are rarely just random spots on the map. They tend to cluster at crossroads of these older networks, where rivers meet, where different ecosystems touch, where traditions already say, this is where people gather. In other words, long before anyone plants a seed on purpose, the highways of civilization are under construction. They're just marked with beads, blades, and stories instead of roads. To see the next step in that process, we have to look at what happens when some of those crossroads stop being purely seasonal and start turning into actual places, settlements big enough and stable enough to reshape the trade networks that created them. Archaeologists have a word for what happens next: sedentism. It doesn't mean big cities or even permanent houses. It just means this: people start coming back to the same spot over and over, often enough that it makes sense to leave things there. For most of the Ice Age, your ancestors' default strategy was mobility. When the game moved, you moved. When a patch of wild grain was exhausted, you shifted camp. Home was wherever the fires burned that season. So why on earth would anyone choose to stay put before they had fields to anchor them? Because sometimes the land itself makes the decision for you. Take one of the most famous examples, Ohallo 3, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in what is now Israel. Around 23,000 years ago, right in the coldest phase of the last ice age, people built a small cluster of brush huts there. Not a one-night campfire stop, but a little village, half a dozen huts, hearths, work areas. Then, almost immediately, the site was drowned by rising water and sealed under mud for millennia. It's an archaeologist's dream and a taphonomy miracle, like someone vacuum-sealed a camp from the Ice Age. What's inside those huts is the interesting part. You'd expect animal bones and some stone tools. You get those, but you also find hundreds of thousands of plant remains. Tiny seeds, bits of grass, wild barley, wild wheat. Some of them were clearly processed, ground, roasted, eaten. There are grinding stones worn from long use. There are fishing tools, bone implements. There's even evidence of wooden structures. No fields. No domesticated crops. But an astonishing diversity of wild foods collected and processed in one place. That's the logic of early sedentism. If you happen to live at a natural jackpot on a lake shore with year-round water, fish, migratory birds nesting in the reeds, marsh plants to dig in one season, and wild cereals to harvest in another, you don't have to chase resources across huge distances. They come to you in waves. Under those conditions, moving constantly becomes less efficient, not more. It starts making sense to invest in a good camp. You reinforce the hut instead of abandoning it. You stash a heavy grinding stone in the corner instead of lugging it to the next valley. You leave behind a pile of firewood, knowing you'll be back before it rots. Ohallo II looks like that kind of place. Not a city, but a hub. A base camp where people lived long enough to wear grooves into their tools, to scatter trash in thick layers, to start treating a spot on the earth as ours. And Ohallo isn't alone. Across the eastern Mediterranean and the Levant, a few thousand years later, you start seeing more sites with the same feel, repeated rebuilding, thick occupation layers, hints that people thought in terms of seasons here, seasons there, not always somewhere new. Sedentism doesn't require agriculture. It just requires resource stability and planning. Planning is the key word. When you know you'll see this place again, next winter or next spring, you can think in terms of storage. You dig a pit and line it with stones or basketry. You dry fish or meat. You parch grain so it lasts longer. You tuck it away. Now this patch of ground isn't just a good camp. It's a refrigerator and a bank. Storage changes everything. If food can be saved, it can also be claimed. Someone has to remember whose pit is whose. Someone has to guard it, or at least agree on rules about who can raid it when times are bad. If a neighbouring band shows up hungry in the lean season, are they allowed to tap your surplus, or do they need to ask or trade or marry in? Suddenly the social map is as important as the physical one. Archaeologists pick up the traces of this in odd ways. At some early sedentary sites, you see multiple phases of building on top of each other. A structure is built, used, demolished, and rebuilt in almost the same footprint. Hearths recur in the same spots. Storage pits get dug, filled, and then new pits cut through the old ones. That layered rebuilding is a community signal. It says, we didn't just pass through. We came back. We remembered where the houses were, even where the evidence is thinner than at waterlogged gems like Ohallo Throw. We can infer similar patterns from the density of remains. Lots of ash, bones, broken tools, and plant residues all piled together suggest long or repeated use. Not a single season's trash. And where sedentism appears, feasting usually isn't far behind. If you already have a known meeting place, somewhere predictable near rich resources, already dotted with half-permanent huts, That spot is a perfect magnet for seasonal aggregation. Think about what that looks like on the ground. For most of the year, maybe only a small resident group lives by the lake or in the valley with the spring. They fish, they gather, they maintain the camp, they guard the storage. Then at a particular time, when the fish run, when a certain plant ripens, when migrating herds funnel through a nearby pass, everyone comes. Bands who've been scattered across the landscape for months converge. Population at the site might double, triple, or more for a few weeks. That's when you see the big hunts, the collective drives, the huge piles of burned bone. That's when the most extravagant objects get exchanged, the most elaborate ornaments get worn, the biggest disputes get aired and resolved. This is feasting in the deep past. Not just we had a nice dinner, but deliberate conspicuous consumption as social technology. You slaughter more animals than your little group strictly needs. You roast them in pits big enough to feed everyone. You open up storage that could have lasted you the winter and share it in front of your peers and in-laws. In a world without ledgers or written laws, that kind of generosity is how you make claims. We fed you this year, you owe us next year. Feasts are credit systems, marriage markets, council meetings and religious festivals all roll together. And they almost always centre on places that people can find again, year after year. Proto-villages, sedentary camps. As people return to the same place to feast and store and rebuild, something subtle but profound happens to their social rules. Mobile bands can often solve conflict with their feet. If you can't stand your brother-in-law, you drift a few valleys away next season. If two families clash, they split and avoid each other. Space absorbs tension. Sedentism steals that escape valve. If your storage pit is here, your best fishing spot is here, your dead are buried here. You can't just walk away at the first argument. You are tied down by infrastructure and memory, so you need other tools. One of them is ritual. Aggregation sites often show higher densities of art, unusual artifacts or structured deposits, things archaeologists cautiously interpret as ritual behavior. Maybe there are shared ceremonies everyone participates in at the start of the season. Maybe there are formalized reconciliation feasts, oath-taking, storytelling in which old grievances are recast as myth. Another tool is hierarchy, even if it's very soft by later standards. Someone has to decide where new huts go, so they're not built on top of old storage. Someone has to arbitrate who can tap which resources. Elders, skilled hunters, or people who host the biggest feasts may gain real authority, not absolute power, but recognized influence. You also start needing clearer ideas about property and inheritance. When a hut is rebuilt in the same place 3 or 4 times, is it belonging to a particular family line? Does a storage pit pass to someone's children? Do rights to a prime fishing spot come bundled with marriage into a certain clan? We can't see the rules directly, but we can see their consequences. Repeated rebuilding in patterned ways, differential access to prime spaces, hints that some households had more or different goods than others. All of this storage, ritual, soft hierarchy, emerging property rules, starts to look less like the fluid politics of small, constantly moving bands, and more like the early grammar of village life. And crucially, it appears before crops are planted in neat rows. Sedentism without agriculture shows us that the social revolution of staying put begins long before wheat is domesticated. People are already experimenting with new ways of living together, already wrestling with the problems of conflict, inequality, and cooperation that will haunt every later city. By the time monumental sites like Göbekli Tepe rise on the hills of Anatolia, they're not coming out of nowhere. They're growing out of centuries of practice in gathering, feasting, and rebuilding at the same spots on the landscape, ritual and settlement woven together long before the first true fields spread around them. High on a ridge in southeastern Turkey, there's a place that shouldn't exist, not at the time it belongs to. Göbekli Tepe sits on a low limestone hill overlooking the plains near the headwaters of the Euphrates. Under the soil, archaeologists have uncovered rings of massive T-shaped pillars, some over 5 meters tall and weighing up to 10 or 15 tons. They're set in circular or oval enclosures, 2 huge central pillars facing each other in the middle, surrounded by smaller ones like a stone forest. Radiocarbon dates from the deepest layers put the main construction around 9,600 to 9,000 BC, with use and rebuilding continuing for a few centuries after. That's thousands of years before the Sumerians, thousands of years before the Egyptian pyramids, and it's also a few hundred, maybe 1,000 years before there's good evidence of full-blown farming in that region. In other words, we're looking at monumental architecture in a world that's still mostly hunting and gathering. The pillars themselves are the most arresting part. They aren't just big stones. Many are carved in low relief with an astonishing menagerie of animals: snarling lions, wild boar, foxes, vultures, cranes, snakes winding down the sides, scorpions, spiders, abstract symbols that may be stylized animals or something more. Some of the pillars have arms carved along their sides, hands folded in front, belts and loincloths etched across the middle. These aren't just posts, they're stylized beings, anthropomorphic presences standing in a ring. This is not the toolkit of a desperate, marginal people eking out a living on the edge of starvation. It's a visual explosion, a symbolic vocabulary carved into stone, anchored in a landscape that people clearly cared about enough to transform on a massive scale. And that's exactly why Göbekli Tepe hit archaeology like a brick. For much of the 20th century, the working model went like this: first agriculture, then surplus, then villages, then specialization, then temples and monuments. In that story, religion and big communal buildings are luxuries you get after you've tamed wheat and barley. Göbekli Tepe flips that script. Here we have something that looks awfully like a temple complex, or at least a dedicated ritual centre, operating before clear evidence of domestic cattle, before clear evidence of cereal fields on the surrounding slopes. The people building it are classified as PPNA in Near Eastern jargon, pre-pottery Neolithic A. No ceramic jars, no baked clay figurines, just stone, bone, wood and wild plants and animals. So how does a society without full agriculture organise the labour to pull this off? Start with the stone. The limestone outcrops are close by, but close still means quarrying, shaping and dragging multi-ton pillars downhill into prepared sockets. That alone implies a deep knowledge of stoneworking, how to detach blocks without shattering them, how to lever and slide them, how to coordinate teams of people on ropes and sleds. You don't do that on a casual afternoon between rabbit hunts. Then there's the carving. The reliefs are not crude. Many are crisp, anatomically observant, composed with a clear sense of balance and emphasis. That suggests skilled specialists, or at least people who had enough time to practice a lot, within a society still mostly living off wild resources. Someone had to feed those carvers and movers. Someone had to plan the layout of the enclosures, decide where each pillar went, maintain the place over generations. You start needing foremen, organisers, maybe ritual leaders who can persuade dozens of people to sweat for days on a project that doesn't directly produce calories. That's where most interpretations converge. Göbekli Tepe looks like a ritual aggregation site on steroids. Instead of a few brush huts by a lucky shoreline, imagine groups from across the region converging on this hill at certain times of year. Archaeologists find enormous amounts of wild animal bone there, especially gazelle, far more than a small resident group would need. Many bones show butchery marks, some are from very young animals, suggesting mass hunts and big deliberate feasts. In this picture, Göbekli Tepe is a ceremonial centre and a feast economy machine. Clans or bands from different valleys arrive with meat, with hides, with exotic stones or shells from their home territories. They participate in rituals focused on the central pillars and the carved animal spirits. They slaughter and roast and eat together on a scale no single group could manage alone. The cost is immense: time, energy, risk of overhunting local herds. But the payoff is social. Feasts cement alliances. They provide chances for marriages, for settling disputes, for reaffirming shared myths. A hilltop ringed with towering stone beings becomes the stage on which you remake your social world each season. Some researchers go further and argue that this ritual centre might actually have helped push people toward farming. The logic is almost upside down. Instead of agriculture enabling monuments, monuments create a demand that agriculture can satisfy. If you have to host 100 guests every year on a predictable date, wild resources might not cut it forever. Planting and tending stands of wild cereals near the site, corralling wild sheep and goats in the surrounding hills begin to look like sensible strategies to guarantee feast supplies. Under that view, Göbekli Tepe is not a product of farming. It's one of the forces that made farming attractive. Not everyone agrees. Some scholars see Göbekli Tepe less as a single temple, and more as a set of community buildings used by small, increasingly sedentary groups who were already experimenting with cultivation. Others emphasize the continuity between these enclosures and later Neolithic village shrines. Maybe the hilltop was never truly isolated from everyday life, just the monumental fringe of a broader settlement pattern we haven't fully uncovered. And then there are the boundaries. Because Göbekli Tepe is so impressive and so early, it's become a magnet for wild speculation. You'll hear claims that it proves a lost global civilization, or that its builders were vastly more technologically advanced than we think. The secure evidence doesn't support that. We see stone, bone, and simple organic tools. We see no metal, no writing, no wheels. The dating comes from radiocarbon on organic remains in well-defined layers, cross-checked across multiple samples and labs. The iconography, while striking, fits into a broader Near Eastern symbolic tradition of dangerous animals and hybrid beings that continues into later, more clearly understood periods. What we can say with some confidence is this. By around 9600 BC, people in this part of Anatolia were capable of organizing large, cooperative projects that didn't directly feed them. They had leaders of some kind, they had ritual specialists, they had enough surplus or enough flexible scheduling of hunting and gathering to devote serious labor to symbolic architecture. We can also say that this happened before rectangular mud brick houses and tidy fields spread across the region. Monumental ritual came first, or at least emerged in parallel with only the earliest patchy experiments in cultivation. Beyond that, we're in the realm of carefully hedged hypotheses. Did Göbekli Tepe host initiation rites, ancestor cults, shamanic visions? Maybe. Did its gatherings sometimes end in conflict as well as cooperation? Almost certainly. Did its need for predictable feasts nudge people toward domesticating plants and animals? The timing is suggestive, but not a slam dunk. What's clear is that by the time we reach Göbekli Tepe, the old picture of slow, linear progress from simple foragers to complex farmers has shattered. Hunter-gatherers, some sedentary, some seasonal, were already building stone monuments, already investing staggering effort in places that existed primarily in the realm of meaning, memory, and myth. When we talk about the origins of civilization, this hilltop in Anatolia has to be part of the story. And just down the chronological road from Göbekli Tepe, in the same general region, another culture will take the next step. Not just monuments before fields, but villages and fields growing together in ways that finally look like the threshold of agriculture as we usually imagine it. Those are the Natufians, and they're about to show us how ritual places and everyday houses merge into something new. In the hills and valleys of what's now Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. There's another kind of "this shouldn't exist yet" moment in the archaeological record. It belongs to a culture we call the Natufians. They appear around 12,500 BC, a bit earlier than Göbekli Tepe, and they occupy a kind of middle ground in human lifeways that used to be treated as a sharp divide. Not quite wandering hunter-gatherers, not quite settled farmers. Think of them as people who discovered that in certain lucky landscapes you could almost stop moving. Natufian sites cluster in what archaeologists call the Levantine Corridor, a strip of land that at the end of the Ice Age was ridiculously rich in wild resources. Hillsides thick with wild barley and wheat, oak and pistachio woodlands, rivers and springs, gazelle herds moving along predictable routes, fish, birds, tortoises, edible seeds and nuts in every direction. If you lived there and knew what you were doing, you could get a lot of calories without chasing migrating herds across hundreds of miles. Natufian communities seem to have taken full advantage of that. Many of their villages were semi-sedentary. People lived most of the year in the same place, in clusters of stone-founded houses, and only moved seasonally if they needed to exploit a particular resource. At first glance, those houses look small and simple, circular or oval structures a few meters across, with low stone walls and brush or thatch roofs. But the important thing is that they're there at all in the same spots for generations. We see rebuilding on top of old foundations. We see floors resurfaced, hearths renewed, storage pits dug and redug. This isn't a campsite. It's a neighborhood. Inside these houses we find the tools that tell us what Natufian life revolved around. Yes, there are hunting weapons, microlithic stone points, blades that could tip arrows and spears. But there's also something new in both quantity and design, grinding stones and mortars everywhere. Big lower grinding slabs worn smooth by years of use, hand-held upper stones that fit perfectly into your palm. Deep stone mortars anchored in house floors or just outside the doors. In some sites they almost litter the place. If you've ever ground grain or seeds by hand, you know it isn't something you do on a whim. It takes time, it takes repetitive motion, it takes a stable base. The plant remains back this up. At late Natufian sites we find heavy use of wild cereals, wheat, barley, rye, as well as legumes and other seeds. Some charred fragments look suspiciously like flatbread or porridge residues. There's debate over exactly how bread-like these foods were, but it's clear that people weren't just popping seeds into their mouths. They were soaking, grinding, heating, transforming plants into more digestible, storable, and shareable forms. In other words, they were running a kind of pre-agricultural kitchen industry. This intensified plant use doesn't mean full domestication yet. The cereals the Natufians harvested were still genetically wild, with brittle stems that shattered easily. But when you cut wild grain in bulk, bring it back to the same settlement, process it in the same grinding areas year after year, you're laying the groundwork, literally and figuratively, for agriculture. You're learning when different plants ripen. You're experimenting with storage. You're noticing that some stands of grain come back denser if you accidentally spill seeds. You're teaching children how to recognize useful grasses and how to use tools their grandparents also used. And while all that's happening, something else is changing. People are tying themselves to specific places with emotional and symbolic ropes, not just practical ones. Natufian sites are famous not just for their houses, but for their cemeteries. We're not talking about a few scattered burials. In some villages there are dozens, sometimes more, often in tightly clustered graveyards near, or even under houses. People are buried in flexed positions, sometimes singly, sometimes in groups. Over time, cemeteries grow as layers of generations accumulate. This is a different kind of relationship to land. If your ancestors are literally under your floor, you're not just attached to the local gazelle herd. You're attached to that exact patch of earth. Graves also give us a window into Natufian social life. and it's a complicated picture. Some burials are quite simple body, maybe a few stone tools, nothing fancy. Others are not. We find individuals buried with carved stone pendants, shell beads, animal teeth, decorated bone tools. One famous grave includes a woman buried with a puppy, suggesting a special relationship with early dogs or at least with tame canids. Does that mean social inequality? Maybe. Some researchers argue that differences in grave goods, body treatment, and burial locations point to emerging status distinctions, certain individuals being marked out as leaders, shamans, or members of privileged lineages. Others are more cautious. In small-scale societies, lavish burials can also reflect community rituals or the role someone played without implying permanent classes in the way we think of later kingdoms. What's clear is that Natufian communities had enough surplus time and resources to invest in the dead, not just the living. They weren't constantly running to keep ahead of starvation. They could stop, dig, arrange, decorate, and remember. That pause, being able to stay put long enough to build houses, use grinding stones and tend to cemeteries, turns out to be fragile. Right in the middle of Natufian history, the climate throws them a curveball. The Younger Dryas, a sudden return to colder, drier conditions around 10,800 BC. Rainfall patterns shift. Some of those lush cereal stands thin out. Wild resources become less predictable. This is where things get interesting. In some areas, Natufian settlements shrink or are abandoned. People go back to more mobile hunting and gathering, following game and seasonal plants across larger ranges. In other regions, though, the response may have been the opposite: double down. If the wild stands aren't as reliable, maybe you start weeding around the ones that remain. Maybe you deliberately seed grain near your village to ensure next year's harvest is closer to home. You store more. You experiment with corralling wild sheep or goats, keeping them close rather than counting on reappearing herds. Not everyone agrees on how far this went. Some archaeologists see the Natufians as the first real farmers, already nudging plants and animals toward domestication under climatic stress. Others see them as sophisticated foragers whose experiments were still very much within the wild spectrum. Either way, the long-term result is unmistakable. By the time conditions warm again, and we move into the pre-pottery Neolithic, the Levant is dotted with communities that look like outgrowths of Natufian lifeways. Stone houses coalescing into villages, grinding stones baked into daily routine, cemeteries binding lineages to place, and fields, now genuinely cultivated, spreading out around them. The road to farming wasn't a single invention. It was this: people who had already learned to live mostly in one place, whose social worlds and spiritual lives were anchored to specific hillsides and springs, being nudged by climate shifts and population pressure to take the final step from gathering wild plants to managing their reproduction. The Natufians sit right on that threshold. They're not yet civilization in the city wall, writing tablet sense. But in their semi-sedentary villages, their heavy grinding stones, their ancestors buried under their floors, you can see the outlines of a new kind of human world, the kind that will eventually make Sumer possible. And they also force us to ask a deeper question. If this much social and economic complexity can emerge before true farming, how much further back might the roots of our so-called civilized behavior actually go? So let's slow down and look carefully at what actually changes next, because this is one of those places where our modern vocabulary can quietly mislead us. We tend to lump everything under agriculture, as if there's a single switch you flip from wild to domesticated. But on the ground, for the people living through it, there are at least 3 different processes in play. Cultivation is about plants and places. It's what happens when you start preparing soil, weeding, burning, watering, and deliberately putting seeds or tubers into the ground where you want them. You can cultivate wild plants. You can still rely on hunting and gathering for most of your calories, and only cultivate a few patches as insurance or convenience. Herding is the animal equivalent. You're not chasing random herds across the landscape anymore. You're following more predictable groups, nudging their movements, maybe protecting them from predators, maybe culling individuals at particular times. You might not own them yet in any legal sense, but you're investing in their survival because their fate is now tied to yours. Domestication is a deeper level. It's not just what humans do to landscapes or animals, it's what generations of human choices do to genes. When you replant seeds from the fattest kernels, year after year, you're not just cultivating. You're running a breeding program, whether you know it or not. When you let the calm goat live and eat the aggressive one, when you keep the puppy that sticks close to camp and kills the one that keeps biting people, you are bending the evolutionary path of those species around your own needs. Domesticated species are those that have been pulled across this invisible line, wheat that no longer shatters easily and instead holds onto its seeds until harvested. Goats that tolerate cramped pens and human proximity better than their wild cousins. Dogs whose puppies instinctively look to human faces for cues. That line was crossed in different places at different times for different organisms. In the Natufian heartlands and the broader Fertile Crescent, the grain story is the familiar one. Over a few thousand years after 10,000 BC, we see wild-type wheats and barleys gradually give way to domestic forms. Thicker seed coats, non-brittle stalks, changes in spikelet structure. These aren't accidents. They're the fossil traces of repeated human decisions about which plants to favour. But this wasn't humanity's only farming experiment, or even necessarily the first. Far to the east, along the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers, other communities were running parallel trials with totally different plants. In southern China, wild rices growing in marshes were gradually turned into the domesticated rice that would later feed empires. In northern China, broomcorn and foxtail millets, tough, drought-resistant grasses, were cultivated and then domesticated, their tiny seeds made larger, their growing cycles better matched to human schedules. Elsewhere, people weren't fixated on grains at all. In the New Guinea highlands, long before there were kings in Mesopotamia, farmers were terracing slopes and tending taro, yams, bananas and sugarcane. In the Americas, other groups were slowly reshaping teosinte into maize and breeding hardy beans and squashes to go with it. In West Africa, sorghum and African rice. In the Sahel, pearl millet. In the Andes, potatoes and quinoa. What ties all of these together is not a single agricultural revolution radiating outward from one enlightened centre. It's the opposite, multiple, messy, overlapping experiments in changing the biology of the species around us. Animals followed their own paths into this new relationship. Some came in through what biologists call the commensal pathway. These are the camp followers and garbage specialists. Wolves that learned to hang around human middens, picking through bones and scraps, gradually becoming less fearful, then actively tolerated, then valued as alarms and hunters. Wild cats attracted to granaries full of mice, tolerated because they were useful pest control. In these cases, the animals almost domesticate themselves along a gradient of increasing familiarity, and humans lean into the process by favouring the friendlier, more useful individuals. Others come in through the prey pathway. Think sheep, goats, cattle, pigs. At first, humans are simply hunting them. Then, as knowledge deepens, the hunt becomes more selective. Take the males at certain ages, spare the females, protect lambing grounds. Over time, some animals are kept alive with the herd, moved deliberately across the landscape, bred under human oversight. Slowly their bodies and behaviours shift, smaller horns, different coat colours, more docile temperaments. The predator has turned into a manager, and then there's the directed pathway, which really takes off later once people understand breeding principles more consciously. This gives you animals like donkeys, horses, camels, and eventually chickens bred for eggs or meat, cattle bred for milk or traction. Here the human hand is very obvious. Specific traits are sought, crosses are planned, and improvement becomes an explicit goal. Even with all this experimentation, farming didn't sweep the world like a miracle technology everyone instantly embraced. It spread unevenly. Sometimes it stalled, sometimes it was resisted. In places where wild resources remained rich and predictable, coastlines with abundant shellfish, river systems full of fish, forests heavy with game, full-time farming could actually be a bad deal. It meant more hours of labour, narrower diets, higher disease loads, and more vulnerability to crop failure. There are well-documented cases where foragers living alongside early farmers ate better, were taller, and had healthier teeth. Some groups adopted parts of the package and ignored others. They might herd animals but keep foraging for most of their plants, or cultivate a few crops while still doing long seasonal hunting trips. For centuries, mixed economies were normal. The neat textbook categories, hunter, gatherer, herder, farmer, are simplifications laid over a very fuzzy reality. So why, in the long run, does farming win? One reason is demographic. Even if farmers work harder and aren't individually better off, fields and herds can support more children per acre than wild landscapes can. Over centuries, that adds up. Farming villages can push into new territories, and their sheer numbers crowd out smaller, mobile groups. The other reason is surplus. Once you have plants and animals that reliably produce more food than your immediate household can consume, you unlock a new kind of time. Some people can afford not to forage or farm every waking hour. They can specialize as toolmakers, builders, ritual experts, traders, organizers of irrigation and harvest schedules. Food becomes something that can be stored, counted, promised, taxed. Surplus is what lets someone stand up in the village and say, if everyone gives me a portion of their grain, I'll build and guard the granary. I'll organize the planting days. I'll make sure the gods are properly honored so the harvest keeps coming. It's what lets debts accumulate, obligations solidify, inequality harden. Step by step, this mixture of biology and social negotiation takes us from Natufian-style villages where ancestors are under the floor, to landscapes where fields and flocks are carefully managed, where plants and animals have been genetically reshaped to fit human needs, and where humans themselves are being reshaped by the new rules of surplus work and power. And that surplus will need managing, which is where something that seems very mundane, even boring, quietly becomes world-changing, the act of keeping track of who owes what to whom. If you want to see the moment civilization quietly crosses an invisible line, don't look for kings or palaces first. Look for people arguing about numbers, because once surplus exists, once food and goods start to pile up in particular places and under particular people's control, a very simple question starts to haunt everyone involved. How do we know this is fair? The earliest answer isn't writing. That comes later. The first answer is administration. You don't need an alphabet to make promises, levy contributions, or skim off a cut of the harvest. You just need a way to remember, and a way for other people to believe you. So, sometime after those early villages of the Fertile Crescent began storing serious amounts of grain and pulses, a new technology appears that looks almost childlike at first glance, little clay tokens. They show up by the thousands, scattered across sites from Iran to Syria, beginning in the 9th and 8th millennia BC and continuing for millennia. Tiny spheres, cones, discs, tetrahedrons. Some are plain, some are marked with lines or impressed dots. For a long time, archaeologists had no idea what to make of them. Then a pattern emerged. Specific shapes and markings almost certainly stood for specific quantities of specific things. A cone might represent a measure of grain. A sphere could mean a jar of oil. A marked disc might stand for a sheep or goat. Individually, they're abstract. Together, they form a physical counting system. Imagine you're a farmer who owes a share of your harvest to a central storehouse. You show up after the threshing is done, deliver your sacks of barley, and in return the official drops a certain number and type of tokens into a little clay envelope, a hollow ball called a bulla. While the clay is still soft, he rolls his personal cylinder seal across the outside and bakes it hard. You walk away holding this sealed ball. You can't see the tokens inside, but everyone knows they're there. The seal on the outside tells anyone who checks that this bulla was issued by that particular official on that particular occasion. If there's ever a dispute, no, I delivered more than that, or you already paid your tax this year, someone can, in theory, break open the bulla and count the tokens inside. Is this writing? Not yet. There's no direct representation of spoken words. But it is something just as radical, externalized memory, coded in standardized objects, backed by social trust. And once you start encoding agreements in clay, other supporting systems snap into focus. You need standard containers and standard measures. A jar has to be more than whatever pot this guy happens to own. A measure of grain has to be recognizable from one village to another. That drives the creation of standardized volumes, weights, and eventually reference artifacts, stone weights carved to known sizes, or agreed basketfuls everyone recognizes as a basic unit. You also need standard identities. The seal rolled across a bulla or impressed on a jar stopper isn't a pretty decoration. It's a signature. It says this came from the household of X, or this was inspected by Y in a world without paper IDs or written contracts. All of this, tokens, bullae, sealings, measures, is bureaucracy before literacy. And it matters because once these systems exist, institutions can start to become larger than any one person's memory. In a small band or a single Natufian-style village, everyone more or less knows who is diligent, who is lazy, who is generous, who is a cheat. Gossip is the accounting system. Status and reputation do most of the regulating work. But when you have dozens of villages tied together by irrigation systems, when herds and grain and textiles are moving in and out of central storehouses, personal memory and informal reputation break down. You can't personally know every shepherd who drops off wool or every labourer who worked on the canal. Clay tablets filled with tokens, sealed jars with impressed stoppers, stones that always weigh the same, these become physical anchors for trust between strangers. They let obligations be tracked across seasons, across distances, even across generations. That's the turning point. Once obligations and entitlements can be stored outside human heads, they can accumulate in new ways. Temples, councils, or chiefs' households can now maintain ongoing claims. These fields have owed us this share of grain for 10 years. This family has borrowed seed from the storehouse 3 times. Next year their share will be smaller. It's a subtle shift, but it's the foundation of everything we'd later recognize as institutional power. Rules stop being just norms policed by community pressure and start to be backed by records. If the token record says you owe even if your personal story says otherwise. Over time, the system itself starts to creak under its own success. Managing tokens for dozens of commodities across hundreds of transactions becomes clumsy. You need a bulla for each agreement. You have to physically break it to check what's inside. Archaeologists actually see a transitional stage where people begin pressing the tokens into the outside of the bulla before sealing them, creating a visible summary of what's inside. And then, sometime in the 4th millennium BC in southern Mesopotamia, the next step appears. People start skipping the tokens altogether. Instead of putting little clay shapes inside a bulla, they simply impress or draw their symbols directly onto a flat piece of clay. One mark for a measure of barley, another for a sheep, another for a jar of oil. The tablet itself becomes the contract, the memory aid, the negotiable object. At first, these marks are purely numerical and pictographic. They're about rations, deliveries, allocations, what we'd call spreadsheets today. The earliest proto-cuneiform tablets are almost entirely admin documents, not myths or royal inscriptions. Writing, in other words, doesn't begin as a way to tell stories. It begins as a way to count. It grows out of centuries of practice in abstract representation. Tokens that stand for goods, seal impressions that stand for people, standardized weights that stand for invisible quantities. Once that logic is in place, once people are comfortable with the idea that a little mark can reliably stand in for something else, the leap from token for grain to sign for the spoken word barley is a small one. From there, things accelerate. The same tablets that track how much grain went into the temple granary can start to include the name of the person responsible, the day it happened, maybe even the deity on whose behalf it was collected. Administrative scribbling slowly bleeds outward into law codes, royal boasts, and eventually literature. But underneath all of that, the epics, the prayers, the royal propaganda is the dry, almost boring core that made it possible. People trying to keep track of stuff. People inventing ways to turn trust, obligation, and quantity into marks in clay. And as those marks proliferate, they make possible something we haven't really talked about yet, settlements so large and complex that they stop being villages altogether and turn into something qualitatively new, cities. So what exactly turns a big settlement into a city? Archaeologists don't use city the way real estate ads do. It isn't just a lot of people in one place. You can cram thousands of refugees into a camp, and it still isn't a city in the technical sense. A true city has a particular fingerprint. First, density. Not just houses, but houses packed close enough that daily life constantly throws strangers together. Narrow lanes, shared walls, limited open space. Once you can't avoid people you don't personally know, you're in urban territory. Second, differentiation. Different parts of the settlement are clearly doing different jobs. One district is full of kilns and slag, another is dominated by storage buildings, another is mostly domestic housing, another is reserved for temples or big ceremonial spaces. That's zoning, long before anyone wrote a planning code. Third, infrastructure. Systems that tie everyone together. Streets or alleys that form a recognizable network, drains or ditches that carry waste, canals or roads that move goods, sometimes defensive walls, or dikes that require coordinated labor far beyond one family or neighborhood. When all three show up together, high density, clear functional zones, and shared infrastructure, you've left the world of village life and entered the urban world. In southern Mesopotamia, that jump shows up most dramatically in a place that would later give its name to a whole cultural era, Uruk. By the late 4th millennium BC, Uruk isn't just big, it's qualitatively different from anything that came before it in the region. One sector is dominated by massive temple platforms, tiered mud brick terraces topped with shrines. Around them, granaries, workshops, and administrative rooms packed with bullae, ceilings, and those brand new clay tablets covered in proto-cuneiform signs. Another sector is thick with evidence of craft production, pottery workshops turning out standardized bevel rim bowls by the tens of thousands, metalworking areas, textile production zones. The trash alone heaps of broken molds, misfired pots and slag tells you this isn't household tinkering. It's industrial, residential areas are pressed into the spaces between. Houses cluster around courtyards, forming dense neighborhoods feeding workers and administrators into temple and workshop complexes every single day. If you could walk through Uruk at its height, it would feel like entering a different kind of human world entirely. Noise, specialization, anonymous crowds, the constant movement of goods into and out of central compounds. And at the center of it all, not kings in the later sense, but institutions, especially temples. Those Uruk temples aren't just religious buildings. They're economic engines. They control huge tracts of land, either directly owned or managed through dependent farmers. Harvests flow in as offerings, obligations, or rent. From there, grain, beer, wool, and oil flow back out as rations to workers, specialists, and attendants. The tablets from Uruk are obsessed with this flow. They track rations issued to workers, barley to the brewer, wool to the weaver, lists of people receiving calculated shares. Most named individuals in the earliest texts are not heroes or kings. They're overseers, scribes, recipients of standardized portions. Think about what that means socially. If one institution can control access to the fields, manage the bulk storage of grain, and decide who gets regular rations of food, cloth, and beer, it doesn't need to wave spears in everyone's faces to be powerful. It has its hands on the choke points of survival. Elites in this context aren't necessarily born as a noble class at first. They crystallize around control of three things: labor, land, and distribution. If you sit at the top of the bureaucracy that assigns work gangs to irrigation canals, you can reward your allies with easier jobs and punish your enemies with backbreaking ones. If you administer temple lands, you can decide which families get plots and which don't. If you run the storerooms, you can quietly adjust whose ration tokens are honoured and whose are lost or delayed. Over generations, that kind of positional advantage hardens. Certain lineages find themselves consistently closer to the levers of grain, land, and accounting. They marry among themselves, pass on offices, teach their children the scribal skills and ritual knowledge that gatekeep entry to the top tiers of the system. Inequality stops being just "that guy has more cows" and becomes institutionalized difference. Some people are structurally plugged into flows of wealth. Others are structurally dependent on those flows. And once there's something worth controlling, there's something worth fighting over. Early cities like Uruk don't emerge in an empty landscape. Other towns, other temple centers, other irrigation systems are growing up along the same rivers. Each wants secure access to water, fields, pastures, trade routes, and labor. Conflict becomes baked into the political geography. We start seeing city walls, thick fortifications encircling dense cores. Are they purely defensive, or also symbols of status and control? Probably both. We see weapons in greater number and variety. We see iconography of prisoners, bound captives, and marching troops on later Uruk-influenced artifacts. At the same time, the political landscape is getting more complex. Instead of a flat patchwork of roughly equal villages, we see hierarchies. A few very large centres like Uruk, and a constellation of smaller towns and villages linked to them by trade, obligation, or coercion. This pattern, urban core, subordinate periphery, institutional elite sitting over flows of land, labour, and goods is what archaeologists mean by the earliest states. Not necessarily a unified kingdom with clearly drawn borders and a single king in the way we imagine later empires. More often, overlapping spheres of influence, temple organizations and proto-palaces, experimenting with how far they can project their authority. And here, the evidence starts to get both richer and trickier. For some things, we're on solid ground. The density of buildings, the layout of districts, the presence of specialized workshops and huge storage facilities that's physical and very hard to argue with. The ration tablets and administrative texts tell us in excruciating detail how goods were allocated and who was responsible on a given day. We can say with high confidence that Uruk-era institutions controlled large surpluses, directed specialized labor, and used writing to keep it all straight. But other questions are much more open. Was there a single king of Uruk in this period, or a council of temple officials and powerful households jostling for influence? How much of the population was coerced into labor versus participating in what might have felt, to them, like a shared religious economic project? Were those fortification walls mostly about real warfare, or about dramatizing power to neighbors and to the city's own inhabitants? On those points, scholars actively disagree. Some see early Mesopotamian cities as essentially extraction machines run by predatory elites, grinding grain and people into wealth. Others emphasize cooperation, the way irrigation systems and flood defenses demanded genuinely collective effort, with elites emerging partly as coordinators rather than pure parasites. Most likely, as with so much in deep history, the truth shifts over time and space. Some cities may have leaned heavily on force and fear. Others may have been held together more by belief, reciprocity, and the lack of better options. What matters for our story is this. By the time cities like Uruk are fully up and running, the basic toolkit of statehood is in place. Dense, stratified populations, zoned urban space plugged into regional trade, institutions with their own identities, property and memories stored in clay. Elites who derive power from their positions within those institutions, fortifications and organized violence shaping the map. That's the moment when human communities stop being just villages plus extra people and become something else entirely. Machines that can mobilize thousands of lives at once. And interestingly, Uruk isn't alone. While it's the clearest early example we have, other regions are starting to experiment with similar forms, different landscapes, different crops, different gods, but familiar patterns of density, hierarchy, and institutional control. Those parallel paths will matter a lot for our question about how old civilization really is, and whether Mesopotamia was truly first, or just the first we can see clearly. Mesopotamia is the clearest early case study we have. But if you zoom out, a pattern starts to appear that's a lot bigger than the Tigris and Euphrates. Take the Nile in Egypt. You don't have a tangle of branching rivers and competing irrigation systems. You have one long, relatively predictable artery running through desert. Every year, like clockwork, well, almost, the river rises, floods the banks, leaves behind a ribbon of rich black silt, then retreats. That regularity shapes everything. Instead of scattered city-states hunched along multiple channels, you get a linear civilization. Towns and proto-cities, strung like beads along a narrow green corridor, all facing the same annual pulse of water and silt. The pressure here isn't secure your irrigation canal from your neighbour so much as coordinate labour up and down the river so the whole floodplain works. By the time we see the first pharaohs consolidating power, the Egyptian toolkit looks familiar. Dense settlements, big storage facilities, specialized craft zones and institutions, palaces and temples sitting on top of the grain flows. But the way it's imagined is different. Mesopotamian cities are often anxious places in the texts. Floods, enemies, gods who need constant appeasing. Egyptian ideology leans hard into cosmic order. The king presents himself as the person who literally makes the Nile rise on time, who keeps chaos outside the narrow band of green on either side of the river. Same underlying pressures organize labor, manage surplus, legitimize hierarchy, but a very different story wrapped around them. Now shift east again to the Indus. Here, in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, we find something even stranger to modern eyes. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in the 3rd millennium BC are big by any standard. Tens of thousands of people at minimum, maybe more. They have that full urban fingerprint, density, zoning, infrastructure. But look closely and the pattern bends in yet another direction. We get finely planned street grids, standardized baked bricks across huge distances, elaborate drainage systems running under streets and between houses, storage buildings, workshops, neighborhoods that clearly specialize in certain crafts. What's missing, or at least muted, is exactly what looms so large in Mesopotamia and Egypt, in your-face kings. We don't see massive royal palaces towering over everyone. We don't see gigantic royal tombs stuffed with golden war gear. Their seals and art are full of animals, abstract symbols, and maybe deities, but not endless images of one guy smiting his enemies. This doesn't mean the Indus world was some kind of egalitarian utopia. There are still bigger and smaller houses, central storage, and whatever was going on in those citadel mounds. But power looks less personalized, less centered on one nameable individual, more embedded in institutions and urban routines. Different trajectory, same basic problem set. How do you keep a huge, dense, specialized population functioning without collapsing under disease, conflict, and chaos? Their answer leans heavily on standardization, planning, and maybe some kind of bureaucratic or corporate control we still don't fully understand. Keep going east, and you run into yet another experiment. Early China, along the Yellow River and its tributaries. Neolithic villages gradually scale up into walled centres. By the late 2nd millennium BC, at places like Anyang, we have clear evidence of a state, royal compounds, craft districts, elite burials with human and animal sacrifice, and a writing system carved on oracle bones to ask the ancestors questions about everything from harvests to warfare. Again, the same fingerprints. Dense populations, zoning, infrastructure, institutional elites. But the surrounding ecology and risks are different. Instead of predictable Nile floods, you have loess soils that erode easily, rivers that can shift course catastrophically, and a climate prone to swings. Warfare between rival lineages is written right into the bone inscriptions. Ancestor worship and divination become key tools for justifying who gets to command which labour, on which land, under which supernatural mandate. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus, early China. 4 very different landscapes, 4 somewhat different flavours of hierarchy, all grappling with similar structural stresses, feeding large populations, managing water, coordinating labour, buffering against famine, legitimizing authority. And all of this is just the old world. Cross over to the Americas, and the supposed script of first farming, then villages, then cities, then writing gets scrambled again. In the Andes and coastal Peru, you get monumental complexes like Caral around 2600 BC, huge platform mounds, sunken plazas, evidence for organized labor and long-distance trade in fish, cotton and exotic goods, without clear evidence of writing, and with a very different farming package centered on things like cotton and gourds as much as grains. Later highland states like Wari and Tiwanaku, and finally the Inca, build vast road systems, administrative centers and storage networks in brutal mountain terrain. They govern millions of people with sophisticated accounting devices like quipu, knotted cords that seem to encode numbers and maybe more, rather than the full scribal bureaucracies we see on clay and papyrus. In Mesoamerica, you get Olmec centers, then cities like Teotihuacan and Tikal, pyramids, plazas, ball courts, markets, complex calendars, and written signs that only partly resemble Old World scripts. Their urbanism and statecraft evolve entirely independently. No Sumerian merchant is sailing over handing out instruction manuals. So when people ask, where was the first civilization? Or who was first to invent cities or writing or the state? There's a problem baked into the question. First sounds simple. Archaeologically, it rarely is. Our evidence is uneven. Some regions preserve mud brick and bone beautifully. Others erase almost everything. One site might happen to be excavated early and in depth. Another still lies under modern farmland or a rising water table. The earliest example we know often just means the earliest thing we've dug up so far that we recognize. On top of that, first assumes a single line of progress, like a relay race where one culture passes the torch to the next. But what the global record actually shows looks more like parallel experiments in how to scale up human groups. Some clearly borrow ideas. There's no serious doubt that influences and technologies move. Mesopotamian writing, for example, radiates out and gets adapted elsewhere in the Near East. Bronze metallurgy spreads across huge distances. Trade routes move not just goods but concepts. Other times the similarities look too general, too tied to basic problems, to require direct contact. You need to count surplus? You invent some form of tokens, tally sticks, quipu or numerals. You need to mark identity and ownership? You invent seals, signet rings, stamp symbols, clan emblems or name glyphs. You need to coordinate irrigation or terracing? You develop some kind of centralized authority, whether it's a council, a temple, a palace, or an ancestor-focused household. Archaeologists argue loudly about when we're seeing independent invention versus diffusion. They look at timing. Does a trait show up in two regions close enough in time that contact is plausible? They map routes. Are there known trade connections, shared materials, or intermediate cultures showing a stepwise spread? They drill down into detail. Are the underlying rules of a writing system or calendar too similar to be coincidence? Or do we just have the same broad idea implemented differently? Sometimes the case for borrowing is clear. The alphabet doesn't pop up randomly in a dozen places. It grows out of earlier Near Eastern scripts and travels. Other times, the weight of evidence points toward parallel development. Agriculture seems to have been independently domesticated in multiple regions: the Near East, China, New Guinea, Mesoamerica, the Andes, maybe parts of Africa. There's no neat chain of handoffs that goes wheat, rice, maize. Different communities confronting the same broad constraints, how to get more calories out of a landscape, arrive at different local solutions. That's the deeper implication of all these cradles of civilization. When environments and populations cross certain thresholds, enough people, enough pressure on resources, enough opportunity to canalize water or move goods, humans keep reinventing big, complex societies, not carbon copies of each other, not marching in a single line from primitive to advanced, but repeatedly finding ways to build dense settlements, enduring institutions, and elaborate symbol systems to hold it all together. You don't need one mysterious master civilization seeding everything. You need what we already know our species had by the late Ice Age: flexible intelligence, capacity for large-scale cooperation, and an appetite for stories that make hierarchy and coordination feel meaningful. Once those ingredients are in place, civilization isn't a one-time accident in Sumer. It's a recurring pattern. And that's exactly what makes the question at the start of this video so provocative. If complex societies keep bubbling up independently whenever conditions are right, how sure are we that the earliest ones we've found are really the earliest that ever existed? To push that question back before 20,000 BC, though, we have to confront an even harder problem. What would a truly lost civilization look like in the archaeological record, and is there any sign of one? So let's be ruthless and precise for a second. If someone says there was a real civilization at 30,000, 50,000, 100,000 BC, not just clever hunter-gatherers, but something on the level of Uruk or Mohenjo-Daro, what would we need to see? We'd need density, not a single cave with pretty art or one odd stone circle. We'd need multiple, independently excavated sites with clear stratigraphy, all pointing to the same time window. Layers of habitation, not just brief camps, thick deposits of trash, broken tools, food waste, hearths, built up over centuries in the same spot. We'd need specialization, evidence that not everyone is doing the same thing all the time. Workshops dedicated to a particular craft. Concentrations of one tool type in one area, another tool type somewhere else. Patterns that look like neighborhoods, production zones, central storage. We'd need infrastructure. At minimum, substantial architecture, foundations, post holes, walls, pavements. Ideally large communal structures that require hundreds or thousands of person-hours to build. Drainage, terracing, controlled access ways. features that only make sense if crowds of people are moving through them regularly. And we'd need systems of record. This doesn't have to be cuneiform tablets. It could be tally marks, standardized tokens, notched bones used systematically, or repeated symbol sets carved or painted in ways that clearly track quantities, ownership, or obligations. Some sign that information was being externalized and managed, not just kept in people's heads. If all of that showed up in multiple locations, all securely dated to, say, 40,000 BC, then we'd be having a very different conversation. So far, we don't have that. We have extraordinary individual sites, brilliant art, complex burials, scattered hints of planning and long-distance exchange, but not that full city-plus-system package deep in the Ice Age. One obvious counter-argument goes like this. Maybe we don't see it because it's underwater. And that's not nonsense. At the height of the last glacial maximum sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today. Entire continental shelves were dry land. If humans were clustering along coasts, which they probably were, huge chunks of their world are now drowned under the waves. Underwater archaeology is starting to nibble at this lost real estate. Divers and remote sensing teams have found submerged Mesolithic and Neolithic sites off Britain and Denmark, ancient shorelines in the Black Sea, drowned landscapes around India, Southeast Asia, the Americas. In some places you can see paleo river channels, preserved forests, even stone tools in situ. So yes, there is a vast, barely explored archive out there. But lower sea level doesn't magically erase the time problem. If there had been large, long-lasting Ice Age cities on those now drowned coasts, we'd expect knock-on effects inland. Trade goods moving up rivers, exotic materials in caves and rock shelters, distinctive tool styles radiating into the interior. Think of how far obsidian or shells travel in later periods. Big coastal polities don't exist in a vacuum. Instead, what we actually see in the Upper Paleolithic is rich, regional variation in hunter-gatherer lifeways, not clear fingerprints of missing empires. Then there are the supposed ruins that show up on TV specials and social media feeds. Mysterious blocks, perfect right angles, pyramids on the seafloor. When geologists and archaeologists investigate these claims properly, a pattern appears. Step 1. Map and sample. Use sonar, photogrammetry, direct dives. Step 2. Look at the material. Is it bedrock or worked stone? Are those blocks natural fracture patterns or quarried pieces? Step 3. Search for context. Are there artifacts, tools, pottery, worked bone embedded in or around the structures? Organic remains that can be dated? Over and over again, the spectacular city resolves into something much less dramatic, and in its own way more interesting. Jointed sandstone that breaks into neat rectangles, basalt columns that naturally form hexagonal pavements, reef structures that mimic stairs. Geology can be shockingly architectural. On the rare occasions something man-made does turn up. A cut stone, a post hole, a wall segment. The dating usually drops it back into the Holocene, the last 10,000 years or so, right in the window, where we already know people are building villages, shrines, and eventually cities. That doesn't mean every fringe idea is garbage or that we should sneer at curiosity. Speculation is part of how science moves. People notice anomalies. They ask wild questions. The key is what you do next. Do you tighten the standards of evidence, invite more data, adjust your views if the facts don't line up? Or do you cling to the story no matter what the cause, the dates, and the artifacts say? A responsible approach treats lost civilization claims like any other hypothesis. Interesting if they make testable predictions, discarded if they don't survive contact with evidence. And this is where the real mystery comes in. Because if you drop the image of skyscraper coasts and global empires, there's still a very live, very exciting possibility on the table. Lost complexity. Not Atlantis. Not worldwide Bronze Age 2.0 at 50,000 BC. But sophisticated, Regionally complex societies that fall short of what we conventionally call civilization, yet are far more structured than the simple small band of foragers stereotype. Groups with large seasonal aggregation sites that look on certain days of the year, like miniature cities. Councils and rituals that coordinate hundreds of people across wide territories. Intricate property and marriage rules never written down but rigidly enforced. Ritual architecture in places we haven't dug yet, or that erosion has half erased. Things that would leave a lighter, patchier footprint than Uruk, but a footprint all the same. So rather than asking were there Ice Age super-civilizations that built glass towers and vanished without a trace, a better question might be, how much social and economic complexity can you hide inside a hunter-gatherer world before it starts to look, in some ways, like a proto-civilization? To answer that, we have to look very closely at what the record actually shows in the late Ice Age, and at a handful of sites that already seem to be pushing right up against that invisible line. If we zoom out from the individual sites and stories, a pattern starts to come into focus. It doesn't look like a single light bulb switching on. It looks like a string of coals scattered across time and space, flaring up at different moments, sometimes going out, sometimes catching on something new, sometimes joining into a larger fire. The first glow on that string is symbolism, by at least 40,000, 30,000 BC, and probably earlier, we see fully developed symbolic behavior, elaborate burials with grave goods, personal ornaments, standardized motifs in cave art and on portable objects. People are not just making tools, they're making meaning. They're tracking identity, status, kinship, myth, in ways that matter enough to invest time and scarce resources. What's important here is that this symbolic world isn't confined to a single magic valley. It shows up from France to Siberia, from southern Africa to Indonesia, in different styles but with the same underlying logic. Humans using marks, colours, objects and bodies to stand for ideas. Out of that symbolic layer, we start to glimpse networks. By 30,000, 20,000 BC, raw materials are moving hundreds of kilometres. Obsidian, marine shells, high-quality flint, rare pigments. Tool styles and ornament types spread across regions. Genetic data backs this up. Distant groups are exchanging mates, not just occasionally bumping into each other. This doesn't mean caravans and customs posts. It means that hunter-gatherer bands are plugged into loose but persistent webs of obligation, reciprocity, and information. Who owes who a favour? Where the herds moved last season? Which valley is taboo this year? The infrastructure is social, not stone, and that makes it easier to miss archaeologically, but no less real. Then in certain places those networks start to condense. After about 20,000 BC, as the Ice Age climate begins its long, uneven thaw, we see large seasonal aggregation sites, places where dozens or hundreds of people come together for part of the year. They build more substantial structures. They dig storage pits. They leave behind dense layers of debris that look suspiciously like neighbourhoods, even if those neighbourhoods only existed for a few weeks or months at a time. In some regions, especially the rich ecotones where different environments meet, these gatherings become more regular, more structured, more anchored to specific spots on the landscape. That's the beginning of settlement, not as a one-way march into permanent villages, but as a thickening of attachment to particular places. And on top of those favoured places, something new appears: monuments. Göbekli Tepe, after 10,000 BC, is the most famous, but it's part of a broader trend. People assemble to raise pillars, build enclosures, shape landscapes into theatres for ritual. These projects require planning, leadership, surplus time, and the ability to coordinate many individuals around a shared vision that isn't about immediate survival. Crucially, the builders at Göbekli Tepe are still foragers. They're hunting gazelle and wild boar, gathering wild plants, not yet ploughing fields. The monument comes before the farm. Only later, sometimes centuries or millennia later, do we see full domestication and farming systems lock in. Long experimentation with wild cereals hardens into dependence. Animal management crosses the line into true herding. Storage and surplus become central, not peripheral. Villages stop being seasonal and start being year-round. Once you have that package, reliable surplus, permanent architecture, dense populations tethered to specific plots of land, the path to states opens: hierarchy, formal offices, institutionalized inequality, record-keeping, law. Mesopotamia, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River. Different details, same underlying logic. So the timeline looks less like civilization appears suddenly at 3500 BC and more like symbolism, wide area networks, recurrent settlements, ritual monuments, embedded farming, bureaucratic states. Not a single origin point, but a cascade of thresholds that different societies cross at different times, sometimes in different orders. And when you frame it that way, the big question changes. Instead of, was there a forgotten civilization at 20,000 BC? A more grounded and honestly more interesting question is, which of these thresholds had already been crossed by then, and where? The evidence we have says that by 20,000 BC, symbolism is fully in play. Networks are absolutely there. Early flexible forms of settlement are emerging in some regions. Monuments and full-time farming, as far as we can currently tell, are still in the future. Another piece of the puzzle is climate. Civilization, in the full cities and states sense, shows up almost entirely within the Holocene, the unusually warm, stable slice of time that begins around 11,700 years ago. Before that, the world lurches between cold snaps and abrupt warmings. Rain belts shift. Ice sheets advance and retreat. In that kind of environment, flexibility is usually a better bet than heavy investment. Why pour labour into permanent fields, canals, and stone architecture if the game board might flip in a few centuries, or even a few decades? Once the climate calms down, especially in regions where resources are naturally concentrated, like river valleys, coasts with rich fisheries, or zones where wild grains carpet the ground, the calculus changes. Suddenly staying put and doubling down begins to pay. So climate stability and resource concentration don't cause civilization in a mechanical way, but they tilt the odds. They make certain combinations of behavior, intensive farming, dense permanent settlements, monumental building, complex administration, more sustainable. At the same time, we need to be careful about drawing the borders too sharply. The line between complex foragers with big ritual sites and early farmers with villages is blurry on the ground. The people at any given site might be experimenting, hedging, mixing strategies. A community could be monument builders and part-time planters and long-distance traders all at once. And we are unavoidably working with a partial record. Organic materials rot, shorelines move. Most of the planet has never been systematically surveyed, let alone excavated. Every decade, new techniques, better radiocarbon calibration, sediment DNA, high-resolution remote sensing push the story earlier or sideways. The first big villages kept getting older as we found Natufian sites. The first monuments jumped backward in time when Göbekli Tepe turned up. It would not be shocking if future discoveries shift some of these thresholds again. That uncertainty is part of why this topic is so addictive. There's real room for surprise. If you enjoy sinking your teeth into exactly this kind of puzzle, the slow, messy, thrilling process of piecing together deep human history, I've put a lot more of it into the book that goes with this series. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com, and there's a discount running this week if you want to grab a copy while you're thinking about it. For now, though, we can say this much. By 20,000 BC, humans have already lit several of the fuses that will eventually lead to civilization. They have art, symbols, complex social rules, and far-flung exchange. In some regions they're starting to cluster, to return to the same places, to build more than they strictly need. What they don't seem to have yet are the full stack of features that define later civilizations. Entrenched agriculture, permanent dense towns, institutional bureaucracy, formal states. But one site on a lonely hill in southeastern Turkey suggests that, as the Ice Age ended, some groups were about to make an audacious move building monumental architecture before they planted their first fields. So where does all of this leave the idea of a civilization at 20,000 BC? If by civilization you mean Sumer with ziggurats and tax tablets and kings, the answer, as far as the evidence goes right now, is no. We don't have cities from that time. We don't have writing, palaces, irrigated fields, or big bureaucratic temples. The things we do have from that period are stone tools, hearths, art, ornaments, and the scattered remains of camps and seasonal gathering spots. But if by civilization you mean something looser, dense networks of meaning, obligation, memory, and shared projects, then the story gets more interesting. It is absolutely plausible that by 20,000 BC some groups had already crossed several important thresholds: rich symbolic worlds, thick regional networks, long-term attachment to key places. They might have had ritual calendars, elaborate kinship systems, and story cycles tracing back further than we can easily imagine. It is plausible that there were social landscapes, constellations of bands, meeting places, sacred hills, taboo valleys that functioned in human minds, a bit like later city-states, centres of pilgrimage, zones of relative safety, places where disputes were settled and alliances made. What we can't honestly say, at least not yet, is that these amounted to a lost global civilization with metalworking, ocean-spanning empires, and skyscrapers swallowed by the sea. There's no credible trace of that in the sediments, in the genetics, or in the slow, incremental changes we see from one archaeological horizon to the next. The record we do have looks more like a long, uneven ramp than a staircase to nowhere. Ideas build on older ideas. Technologies grow more complex in ways we can track. Population densities creep up. Storage becomes more important. Ritual spaces grow larger and more formalized. Eventually, in a few lucky or unlucky places, those trends converge into cities and states. Could that ramp have started earlier than we currently think, in ways we haven't yet detected? Absolutely. Could there be regions, now drowned coastlines, buried floodplains, unexplored interiors, where we'll one day find evidence that pushes some of these thresholds back another few thousand years? It would almost be surprising if we didn't. The real question, I think, is not, were there Atlantean super-civilizations, but how many different ways did humans learn to be complex before they ever laid a brick? And that's where you come in. Where do you think the line should be drawn? At writing? At cities? At monumental architecture? Or should we count far-flung ritual networks of foragers as a kind of early civilization in their own right? Let me know what you think in the comments. And while you're there, tell me where you're listening from. One of my favourite things about doing these deep prehistory dives is seeing people from all over the modern world, places that were tundra, savanna, or seafloor in the stories we're talking about, show up in the same comment thread. If you've enjoyed this exploration of the long road before Sumer, it really helps if you tap like, drop a comment, and subscribe. That's the modern version of sending obsidian and shells down the trade routes. It keeps the network alive and lets me keep making these. And if you want to go further down the rabbit hole with more sites, more puzzles, and more of the weird, half-visible experiments our ancestors tried before civilization as we usually define it, if you'd like to support this channel and get a deeper, slower version of the story we've been tracing here, that's the best place to start. For now, we can say this much, honestly, and with some wonder. Human civilization is younger than many myths claim, but the roots of it, our capacity for symbol, story, cooperation, and long-term projects, are older than we expected, and maybe older than we've even begun to uncover.